interesting thing happened in the post-World War II era in this country, and that is that we stopped breastfeeding and we started feeding infants formula. It's really kind of crazy in hindsight because breastfeeding is popular again and people sort of understand that it's good for health. But there was this whole period of time when it became déclassé almost to breastfeed. And many women who had babies in the 1940s and 50s didn't even consider it. So there's a whole generation of children that were raised in this country that were never breastfed. It is getting back into vogue, and thank goodness, because breastfeeding is of crucial importance for health, and there's myriad studies that show this. A number of reasons why breastfeeding is important to health is because breastfeeding actually helps prime the immune system. You know, the development of the microbiome is of critical importance to immune function, and that's where it starts, is in breastfeeding. And mothers actually transfer good bacteria, some of which are known as the class of bacteria called bifidobacteria. That's really a particular kind of microbe that populates your gut when you breastfeed. Without that, it's difficult to populate the gut with that kind of good bacteria, which again is important for immune function and detoxification and nutrient synthesis, all these important roles that the microbes play. So it's not just about microbes. Microbes are an important part of why breastfeeding is important, but also for babies, breastfeeding actually helps to develop the oral motor muscles. And so drinking out of a bottle is a different kind of oral motor development, and that has to do with teaching the baby how to breathe through their nose, which is a really important thing that you need to do to protect your health. Breathe through your nose rather than your mouth, and breastfeeding teaches that. And bottle feeding is not the same kind of oral motor development. So we started in the 1990s, maybe in the last 20 years, beginning to talk in public health campaigns about how important breastfeeding is, but it still isn't universal that all babies are breastfed. I mean, you have especially a lot of there's a lot of socioeconomic divisions. Women who work maybe don't have the capacity to breastfeed, don't have the ability to breastfeed, but it's when babies aren't breastfed, they're really missing out on an important start to their immune health. We know antibiotics are devastating for the microbiome. Kids take them routinely for ear infections, strep throat, whatever it is. They're just used ubiquitously as a medicine for humans, and we know that's a problem. But the thing is, people don't think about the antibiotics that they're consuming when they eat their chicken or their beef or their pork, because those animals are, when they're raised in an industrial setting, are usually fed antibiotics. And what's interesting is that the reason that happens is because sort of the post-World War II era, as we were really ramping up industrial meat farming, farmers started to realize that when you fed animals antibiotics, they actually bulked up, which is what you want as a farmer, right? Because you want a bigger animal to sell. And if you extrapolate what that means for humans who are taking antibiotics, humans taking antibiotics actually bulk up too. And it is part of what's contributing to the obesity epidemic, is the fact that human beings have been exposed to so many antibiotics. And it has to do with disrupting the gut microbiome. It disrupts the animal's microbiome, it disrupts our microbiome, but we don't even think about the fact that when you eat that fast food chicken or that fast food hamburger, you're getting a dose of antibiotics in there. And also, there's non-pharmaceutical antibiotics that we're getting, meaning antimicrobials, like the hand sanitizers and all the disinfectants that are around us. That is having a similar impact as well. We're way too afraid of germs in this country, and we need to embrace the fact that we need a good balance of germs in and around our body to actually thrive, to be healthy. Early puberty is commonly seen now amongst girls and boys. And there's lots of reasons that people speculate this might be happening, but it is about girls entering puberty as young as 7 or 8 years old, and boys maybe a little bit later, but still earlier than what is considered normal. And there's probably a lot of things playing into that. There may be increased exposure to endocrine disruptors, things that are in our plastics, and we have plastic everywhere. We drink from plastic water bottles, and people think, well, I bought water bottles without BPA in it, so I should be fine. And BPA is the known toxin that is supposed to be, endocrine disrupting. There are thousands of endocrine disrupting chemicals out there every day that we're exposed to. There are things that you put on your skin. They're in the foods we eat, the water we drink. There's tons of things that are impacting our endocrine systems, which is of crucial importance for kids when they're growing and developing, and especially you'll see it when they hit that puberty at 7 or 8, because you know that they've had their endocrine system impacted probably by some of these toxic exposures that they get every single day. So we know it's important for women to eat healthy when they're pregnant. Everyone talks about all the things that you can do to have a healthy pregnancy: exercise, eat well, get lots of sleep. That's really important. But we don't always tell women to be careful about pharmaceutical medications they might be taking during pregnancy, which is actually of critical importance, not just for how that pharmaceutical might be impacting the fetus, but also for how it might impact the mother's microbiome, which when the baby is born is transferred from the mother to the baby. So when a baby's born vaginally, the baby basically is inoculated with the microbes that the mother has. It's part of that natural transfer. But a mother who's been taking, let's say, PPIs, proton pump inhibitors, Prilosec or Prevacid kind of drugs for heartburn, which is very, very common in pregnancy for women to feel heartburn, she's completely altering her microbiome. And so you're going to have that microbiome that's been disrupted transferred immediately to baby at birth. That's a real concern. Another thing that's a concern about drugs that are taken during pregnancy or in and around labor is that a common birthing practice that we have in our hospitals is to swab women at 37, 38 weeks of pregnancy to look for group beta strep. Group beta strep has been associated with sepsis and meningitis, so we do a prophylactic scan to see if women have it. So they get a vaginal swab looking for this microbe. If they're positive, then the women are put on IV antibiotics during labor. That's very standard practice that's done in almost every hospital in this country. The problem with that is that being positive for group beta strep doesn't mean that's going to be harmful to the baby. It does not mean that the baby's going to be septic or have meningitis. But what it does mean is that that baby is going to receive IV antibiotics because of hospital procedure. At any given time, 40% of women are walking around with group beta strep in their vaginal flora. So that means pregnant women going into the hospital, roughly 40% of them are going to test positive for group beta strep. That means roughly 40% of babies are going to be born with IV antibiotics. If you layer on top of that the number of C-sections we have in this country, we have about a third of live births are with C-sections. So when you have a C-section, you're also given antibiotics. So if you think about all the women who are getting antibiotics for group beta strep protocol, plus all the C-sections, the vast majority of babies born in the United States are being born on antibiotics, with the mother receiving antibiotics intravenously during labor and delivery. That's a major problem, because what needs to be happening is that sacred transfer of the mother's microbiome to the baby at that critical time of birth. And instead, what's happening is that the baby's getting a completely altered microbiome that's been disrupted by the mother's antibiotics. In 1991, I think it was the beginning of the 90s when we began direct-to-consumer advertising pharmaceuticals to the public. Before that, we didn't advertise pharmaceuticals. That's worth noting and worth remembering, that we see so many advertisements for pharmaceuticals on the TV right now that we almost forget that didn't used to happen. So that began in the 1990s, and during the first year or two that there was direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals, there was something like a $40 or $50 million that was spent on that kind of advertising. Fast forward to now, there are billions and billions of dollars spent every year on direct-to-consumer advertising. What's interesting about that is we are the only country outside of New Zealand that actually allows direct-to-consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals to the public. And the consequence is that Americans consume over half of the world's production of pharmaceuticals. So all the pharmaceuticals that are produced in the world, Americans consume half of them. And then the next country behind us, which consumes the next highest quantity of pharmaceuticals, is Japan. And they consume 9% of the world's pharmaceuticals. That's insane, the amount of pharmaceutical drugs that the United States is consuming. One of the interesting things about the American medical system is how dependent it is on pharmaceuticals. It's as if it's the only tool bag in many physicians' practices. Physicians used to spend more time talking about nutrition and sleep and exercise and all the important things, and many of the good physicians still do, but there is such pressure from the pharmaceutical industry to push out their latest drug. You have one pharmaceutical sales rep for every 4 doctors out there. That's an enormous amount of time that doctors are spending with pharmaceutical sales reps learning about the latest drug that may or may not be helpful for their patient population. But the pressure is incredible and intense from the pharmaceutical industry to push out their latest medication. Sunscreens. There are good ones and bad ones. Sunscreens can be a huge source of toxic exposure for kids because of the chemicals, especially in aerosol sunscreens or sunscreens that are over 50 SPF. But the toxins in sunscreens isn't the only concern, and there are some safer sunscreens. The Environmental Working Group has a great database that you can see what some of the toxins in sunscreens are. So toxicity of sunscreen is one issue. The other issue with sunscreens is that when you put sunscreen on your skin every day, which is what many people do because they're afraid of skin cancer and they're afraid of that sun exposure, and they wear sunglasses on their eyes to protect their eyes from the sun exposure. The problem with that is that human beings developed over millennia under the sun and with the exposure to the sun, and there are critical processes in our body that require sun exposure on our skin. Synthesis of vitamin D, that important vitamin 4, hormone vitamin 4, our immune function. That's just one of myriad things the sun does for us by being exposed to our skin. And we have become so afraid of the sun and sun exposure that we don't allow ourselves to go outside without sunscreen or covering up. And in doing that has all kinds of health effects. Here's a great example. When you get up in the morning, the first thing you're supposed to do is see the sun or see the natural sunlight, full spectrum sunlight. And that actually triggers the circadian rhythm in your body that tells you when to wake up and when to sleep, and all of the things the processes that happen in your body, everything from digestion to circulation of the lymph, that all of these things happen on a biorhythm that is regulated by the sun. If you don't go outside and see that sun, you're not regulating on that circadian rhythm. You're not regulating on that biorhythm. And another example is when we go indoors at night and the sun goes down and we turn the lights on and we get on our computers and our laptops and our devices, which give out blue light that is actually mimicking the sunlight. What you're doing is you're telling your body it's daytime. I'm still awake because it's daytime, I'm seeing blue light, and that actually interferes with your sleep. When you look at blue light from a device, from a TV or iPhone or whatever it is, it actually suppresses the production of melatonin, and you need melatonin to sleep. So a lot of times people have sleeping problems. Children will be playing video games right before bedtime, and then they can't fall asleep. It's because you're not getting the melatonin release that you need to help you fall asleep. So we need to be exposed to natural sunlight without sunscreen, without our sunglasses on for a period of time so that we can regulate our biorhythms. And we also need to, by the same token, when the sun goes down, kind of mimic that a little bit in our homes by turning the lights down low or using red light instead of blue light, and just try and live more in natural rhythms. Yeah, there is this perception that people who are afraid of cell phone, electromagnetic radiation, radio frequency, these kinds of things, are people who wear tinfoil hats, and are crazy, out of their minds. What is the concern about EMF exposure or cell phone exposure? Is this all made up? Is there science behind it? And increasingly there is a building body of evidence that exposure to EMFs cell phones, high tension power lines, all these kinds of things are actually disruptive to the body. So what happens with EMF exposure is it actually is like your body is exposed to some kind of allergen. It's like it causes a chronic immune stimulation. So if you're thinking about the total load of factors that somebody is experiencing on their health, it may be toxic exposure, it may be they may be experiencing inflammation from food sensitivities. EMFs are just one more drop in the bucket. It's just one more exposure that is causing your body to feel stress. And there's all kinds of evidence coming out linking EMF exposure, cell phone exposure to cancers. And a lot of this research is being suppressed, unfortunately, because of the, what would that do? What if we didn't have our devices? That is just such an incomprehensible thing for most people. But I think there are smart ways to use your devices and smart ways to be around electronics where you minimize the impact, because they actually do have a real impact on your health. One specific way that EMFs affect our bodies is that EMFs are known to open the blood-brain barrier. So if you think about the importance of the blood-brain barrier, it keeps things out of the brain that are not supposed to be there, toxins, infectious agents, etc. And when you have exposure to EMFs, you're opening up the blood-brain barrier and you're making yourself more vulnerable to those kinds of things accessing your brain. So it's kind of like a perfect storm. If you take toxins plus the EMF exposure, that's going to have a greater impact, a more synergistic kind of impact on your body. We live in a chemical soup, and the frank reality is we don't even know what chemicals are in our body. The EWG Environmental Working Group published a study where they claimed that 287 chemicals were found in umbilical cord blood for infants when they were born. These were babies who were just born. They hadn't even had time to acquire a toxic load, but they were basically acquiring their mother's toxic load. So where are all these things coming from? It's just that everything that is part of the modern industrialized world is synthetic. It's things we manufacture, and all those manufacturing processes are just riddled with chemicals and toxins. And it's been such a short period of time that we've lived like this, that we just haven't woken up to the impact, to the individual impact of those toxins. So the impact of lead or perchlorate or mercury or whatever the particular toxin is. The research is coming, we're just studying it, but we haven't given any kind of thought to what is all of this synergistically doing in our bodies. So I think people are beginning to wake up, and I think we're starting to see that it's better for us to use things that are natural and to avoid the things that are new to nature, because we don't know what those things are doing in our body, let alone what they're doing synergistically with all the other kinds of chemicals. Sugar is ubiquitous in the American diet. It is something that pretty much everybody consumes a whole lot of every day. And most often people aren't even aware that when you're drinking that Coca-Cola or that iced tea or that Gatorade, that you're actually consuming a whole bunch of sugar. And that sugar is something that is problematic, not just for the fact that it's going to create insulin resistance down the line, but actually we're consuming a whole bunch of refined carbohydrates and sugars that affect your microbial composition in your gut. And why that's important is because if you eat a lot of refined carbohydrates and refined sugars, it grows a certain type of bacteria in your gut, a certain type of yeast in your gut. If you eat a lot of fibrous foods, a lot of vegetables and fruits, it grows another type of bacteria or yeast in your gut. And so the ones that you want to grow, the types of microbes you want to grow in your gut or culture in your gut, are the ones that grow on vegetables. And unfortunately, so few people in American society eat enough vegetables and way too much sugar. So we're really feeding the wrong microbes in our guts. I always tell my kids that they have pets in their guts, and it's important for them to feed their pets the right food. And if you feed them too much sugar, you're going to have really nasty pets who are in there trying to hurt you. That's kind of how I explain it to my kids. But it's it's a problem, and the problem with sugar is that it is addictive. More addictive than cocaine even. So it's a problem that we need to be very conscious about and need to start removing it from our foods and removing it as an additive and making better choices around it. Americans have never really eaten that well. But since the end of World War II, we really have accelerated our poor diet, partly because we really industrialized most of our food production, industrialized farming, industrialized meat production. Everything we ate went into a box or a package or a can, so we stopped eating fresh food. And this has created a kind of cultural norm where what you eat comes out of a box or belongs in a pantry. So we just don't eat the types of foods that support good health. We don't eat fresh food. We don't eat food that is nutrient dense anymore. One of the reasons the food we're getting is so nutrient poor is partly because of the processing. When you process wheat, for instance, you strip out many of the nutrients. When you refine a flour, refine a sugar, all the nutrients go by the wayside. But another reason is because we have destroyed our soils. Our soils have been over-farmed. They're depleted of critical nutrients. They're depleted of critical soil microbes, which actually play a really important role in creating nutrient-dense food. So even if we think we're eating, the healthiest foods, we eat lots of salads or whatever it is, those salads are probably nutrient depleted, not as rich in nutrients as they might have been a couple hundred years ago. So I think there's a movement towards biodynamic farming, which is sort of an integrated farming approach, which is trying to replenish the soils with nutrients. But that is a very small fraction of the type of farming that we do. Most of it is industrial and is destroying the soil, destroying the food, and removing the nutrients that we need to stay healthy. You know what I think is interesting is the fact that we in this country have kids' menus. What is that? Kids' menus, right? So if you go to a restaurant, you have an adult menu and a kid menu. And what's on the kid menu? French fries, chicken nuggets, pizza, plain pasta. We've created white foods as the only foods that kids will eat. We make this assumption. So there's a whole culture around kids' foods where we don't insist upon them eating healthy. We don't expect them to eat vegetables. The cultural norm is that kids don't like vegetables, so I'm not even going to try. That's just nonsense. That's total nonsense. That's something that we have created, I think, to make our lives easier. Because yes, pizza tastes better than broccoli to the average palate, but we need to insist that children eat the same food that adults eat, and they need to be foods that are whole foods, real foods that haven't been processed, that haven't made their way through the industrial system. We need to go back to the basics when it comes to food and stop this nonsense where we think kids eat something different from grown-ups. They're not like a different species, but yet we treat them as if they are a different species that requires a separate kind of food that is junk food. That's wrong. The research around genetically modified organisms has been mounting over the last few decades. They were touted as this great technology that would help feed the world, sounded great, but what they're finding is that genetically modified organisms are grown and they are mass produced in such a way that they require tons of chemicals sprayed on them in order to make the whole system work. So what's happening is you're growing large amounts of corn or soy or canola. Those are sort of the top genetically modified crops. And then we're coming in and spraying them with herbicide that these plants are supposed to be resistant to. So in essence, in some ways, you're actually eating an herbicide because the plants are designed to be resistant to the herbicide, and you're eating it in the crop. And then you're just going to be consuming an enormous volume of herbicides and pesticides that are sprayed on these things. And there's mounting research that glyphosate has all kinds of negative biological effects, disrupting the gut microbes, and all kinds of downstream effects from eating GMOs that we don't even know about because it's so new and they've only been studied for a short period of time. I think with any new technology, we have to tread really lightly and be very careful, especially when it comes to nutrition. When we know that we need the most pristine nutrition to keep ourselves healthy in a toxic world. So there was a time period when I had an awakening. I think I was going through life not really aware of all the things that were impacting my health or my kids' health. And I was fortunate enough to wake up to it. It's fortunate to wake up to see what was really going on, and that I was responsible for taking care of my own health. And that there were many people around me who weren't aware of all of the things that were negatively impacting their health, everything that they were doing every single day, what they were eating, what they were drinking, what they were putting on their skin. People just don't have an awareness. I feel like it's a moral imperative to wake people up to what is happening, not just for our own health. I mean, at my age, I'm looking at my peers who are getting cancer and heart disease and diabetes, but I feel like it is a moral imperative for our kids that we wake the world up, because the planet is being destroyed and we will not be here any longer if we don't take care of the planet. And future generations just aren't going to be able to adapt to the toxic world we live in. So I feel like it's important to participate in conferences like the Real Truth About Health conference, because we need to spread the word. We need to raise awareness and let people know what's really happening, but also that they can take back their health, that they can take responsibility for their own health and planetary health by just making changes, just basic changes in what they do every single day.